The sun was setting, casting a soft glow over the parking lot. Ethan Hayes sat quietly in his car, watching the warm light fade across the concrete. Tonight felt peaceful, one of those rare, perfect Saturday evenings when everything just seemed to fall into place. He glanced at his watch, mentally calculating how long his wife, Grace, had been in the store. Just a few more minutes, he thought, his mind settling comfortably in the routine. But that calm was shattered in an instant. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flooded his rearview mirror, flashing like an unexpected storm. Ethan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he registered the patrol car pulling up behind him, its engine a low, ominous rumble. His mind raced. This felt different, wrong somehow. It wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement, but as he watched the officer step out and approach, there was a cold intensity in the man's eyes, something unyielding. Instinctively, Ethan braced himself. What was meant to be a quiet evening was quickly unraveling into something entirely unexpected. Subscribe for more stories that bring real-life challenges to light. The officer strode forward, slow and deliberate, each step radiating purpose. As he neared, Ethan caught sight of the badge gleaming on the man's chest, Officer Dylan Barnes. But there was something else. Dylan's hand hovered near his holster, fingers flexing slightly, as if the man were preparing for a threat. "Evening, officer," Ethan greeted, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel, his voice steady. Dylan didn't respond with the usual pleasantries. Instead, he stopped just short of the window, his face unreadable, eyes fixed on Ethan like he was assessing a threat. "What are you doing here?" Dylan's voice was cold, clipped, no warmth, no welcome. Just a demand. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He took a steadying breath before answering. "Waiting for my wife," he replied evenly. "She's inside, grabbing a few things." "Is there a problem?" Dylan ignored the question, his gaze piercing, scanning the interior of the car as though he expected to find something incriminating. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Dylan said, his tone flat, his hand resting on his gun. The words carried an unspoken accusation, one Ethan had heard too many times before. He knew that suspicious activity was often just code, a flimsy excuse to justify unnecessary scrutiny. Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing. There was no reason he should have to get out of the car. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, he knew all too well how quickly a situation like this could spiral out of control. The air between them thickened with tension, an invisible barrier of suspicion that needed only the smallest spark to ignite. "Officer, I don't see any reason for this," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just sitting here, waiting for my wife." The officer's expression hardened, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. "I said step out of the vehicle." Dylan's voice was more forceful this time, rising just enough to make it clear that this was not a request. Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't want to escalate things, but Dylan's insistence made it clear that he wasn't looking for cooperation, he was looking for compliance. Ethan lifted his hands slightly, a gesture of non-resistance. "I'm not resisting, officer, but I'd like to understand what's happening here." Dylan's jaw clenched, his tone edging on anger. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he shot back. "Step out of the car. Now." Ethan hesitated, the tension mounting. He glanced around briefly, noting the empty parking lot, realizing there was no one nearby to witness whatever might come next. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, he reached for the door handle, careful not to make any sudden movements. The last thing he wanted was to give Dylan any reason to act on the hostility simmering between them. As soon as the door cracked open, Dylan was on him, grabbing Ethan's arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that felt excessive, unnecessary. "Turn around!" Dylan's order came out in a harsh whisper, barely containing whatever emotion was boiling beneath the surface. Ethan winced, feeling the sharp pain radiate through his shoulder as he was shoved against the side of the car. "Officer, this isn't necessary," Ethan managed, his voice strained but controlled. "You're making a mistake." But Dylan didn't seem to hear him. His breathing was heavy, almost ragged, his eyes flickering with something darker, anger, maybe even fear. "You think you can just sit here like you own the place?" Dylan hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "I don't care who you're waiting for, you don't belong here." And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't about any suspicious activity or reports from the area. It wasn't even about enforcing the law. It was about control. Dylan needed to feel in charge, and Ethan's presence, his skin, had somehow challenged that. Ethan gasped as the pressure on his arm intensified, his shoulder throbbing from Dylan's excessive grip. In the scuffle, something slipped from his jacket pocket, landing on the pavement with a soft, metallic clink. The small, laminated card caught the light as it lay on the ground. Dylan's eyes darted to it, curiosity momentarily overtaking his anger. He reached down, picked it up, and turned it over. The color drained from Dylan's face as he read the title on the ID, Major General Ethan Hayes. His hand trembled, grip loosening, as the enormity of his mistake sank in. The title, the rank, it all shattered his confidence in an instant. For a beat they stood frozen. Ethan straightened, his gaze steady and unwavering, despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. Dylan stammered, searching for words. "You're Major General Hayes?" he muttered, his voice barely audible, a mixture of disbelief and shame cracking through. Ethan's steady gaze held firm. "That's right," he replied, calm but resolute. As the tension hung thick in the air, a new voice cut through the stillness, sharp, clear, unmistakably protective. "What's going on here?" Ethan and Dylan turned to see Grace Hayes stepping out of the store, her eyes narrowing as they took in the scene before her. In one glance, she saw her husband, the pain etched across his face, and the officer standing rigid, shame coloring his expression. Grace's posture was calm yet commanding, her presence undeniable. She crossed the parking lot with purposeful strides, her gaze never leaving Dylan. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice cold, measured, and unapologetically direct. Dylan swallowed, visibly unnerved by her presence, but managed to stammer. "Ma'am, I thought there was suspicious activity." Grace cut him off, raising an eyebrow as she took a steady breath. "Suspicious activity? My husband sitting in a car waiting for me? That's suspicious now?" Her tone was sharp, each word a precise strike, exposing the absurdity of Dylan's claims. Dylan's face reddened, his composure faltering. As he looked at her, something in his gaze shifted, recognition dawning, as though he'd seen her before but couldn't quite place it. And indeed, he had. Grace Hayes was not only the wife of a major general but the daughter of one of the state's most influential senators. Her name carried weight, a weight he could suddenly feel pressing down on him. Grace held his gaze steadily, then pulled out her phone and, without breaking eye contact, dialed a number. "Yes, connect me to Commissioner Reynolds," she said, her voice calm but steely. "Tell him Grace Hayes needs a word." Dylan's face turned ashen as her words sank in. The parking lot had grown quieter, yet a tension buzzed in the air as a small crowd gathered, murmurs of shock and disapproval spreading. Grace's phone call had already set things in motion. Within minutes, the low wail of sirens filled the evening, and 2 additional patrol cars pulled into the lot. The newly arrived officers stepped out, immediately taking in the scene. Major General Ethan Hayes standing tall, a steely look in his eyes, his wife Grace by his side, radiating calm fury, and Officer Dylan Barnes, visibly shaken, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread. One of the senior officers, Lieutenant Carson, approached cautiously, his face a mask of professionalism but his eyes betraying concern. "Barnes," he called, his voice steady but firm. "What's going on here?" Dylan swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "There was suspicion of activity and But before he could finish, a man from the crowd stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I've got this recorded," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This officer punched him, for no reason." A ripple went through the crowd, gasps and whispers building as the footage played, the image of Dylan's fist connecting with Ethan's stomach clear on the small screen. Lieutenant Carson's face tightened as he processed what he was seeing. His eyes turned cold as he looked back at Dylan, then at Ethan, nodding with respectful recognition. Major General Hayes. Carson addressed Ethan, his tone measured, then shifted his gaze to Dylan. Barnes, hand over your badge. Dylan's face paled, and he took a shaky breath, his fingers trembling as he unpinned his badge. For a moment, he looked as if he might argue, but the weight of his actions was undeniable. His career, his sense of authority, it was unraveling before him, piece by piece. As Dylan dropped his badge into Carson's outstretched hand, silence filled the lot, thick with the undeniable truth of what had just unfolded. The silence hung heavy, an unspoken judgment filling the air. The crowd, once murmuring with disbelief, had quieted, their expressions shifting from outrage to anticipation. All eyes were on Ethan, the man at the center of this storm, whose quiet dignity had anchored every onlooker through the chaos. Lieutenant Carson, still holding Dylan's badge, looked toward Ethan with a respectful nod. Major General Hayes, he said carefully, we can move forward with an official complaint. The evidence is clear, and we'll ensure justice is served. Ethan took a steady breath, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations pressing on him. He looked at Dylan, who stood there, eyes cast downward, shoulders slumped as if under the crushing weight of his own actions. It was as if the full impact of what he'd done had finally landed on him, stripping away any pretense of authority or righteousness. Ethan could feel the crowd's energy, their silent calls for retribution, for justice. But he looked deeper, past Dylan's uniform, past the mistake he'd made today, and saw the man, broken, beneath it all. Ethan had faced men in the line of duty who carried hatred and pain, and he knew that some consequences were heavier than any formal punishment could be. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice calm but firm enough to carry through the crowd. No, he said, holding Carson's gaze. I'm not pressing charges. A collective gasp rippled through the bystanders, and even Carson blinked in surprise. Dylan, still not daring to meet Ethan's eyes, looked stunned, as though he couldn't fathom why Ethan would choose mercy over vengeance. Ethan, are you sure about this? Grace asked softly, her tone laced with both pride and concern. She knew her husband's heart better than anyone, but this was a level of forgiveness that left even her speechless. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady on Dylan. He's already lost his badge, his authority. That's enough for me. He took a step closer to Dylan, looking him in the eye. But more than that, Ethan continued, his voice lowering. I want you to carry this with you. I want you to live with the weight of what you've done today. Dylan's face fell further, his body language collapsing under the burden of Ethan's words. No one had to say it aloud, but it was clear, Ethan's mercy was a punishment of its own, one that would stay with Dylan far longer than any reprimand or suspension. The crowd, once filled with tension, began to murmur again, though now in tones of awe and reflection. They had come expecting to see justice dealt swiftly, but what they witnessed instead was something deeper, something that transcended the usual cycles of anger and retribution. One of the bystanders shook his head slowly, murmuring to a friend, He's giving him a chance to be a better man. That's something else. Dylan finally lifted his gaze, meeting Ethan's eyes, his expression a mix of shame and gratitude he couldn't put into words. Thank you, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the moment stripping away any pride he might have once held. Ethan gave a small nod, then turned back to Grace, who was watching him with a quiet admiration. She took his hand, squeezing it gently as if to convey all the emotion she felt in that single gesture. They had come for a simple evening, but left having changed lives, not just their own, but everyone who had witnessed Ethan's act of mercy. And as they walked away, hand in hand, it was clear that Ethan's decision would linger, becoming a story shared, a lesson learned, and a reminder of what true strength looked like. As the crowd's murmurs softened, a commanding voice cut through. Major General Hayes. Ethan turned to see Chief Reynolds approaching, his expression somber, yet respectful. Flanked by two senior officers, Reynolds walked with a purpose that conveyed both authority and a quiet remorse. Extending his hand to Ethan, he said, General Hayes, I came as soon as I heard. Are you all right? Ethan accepted the handshake, meeting Reynolds's gaze with a calm but unyielding expression. I'll be fine, he replied. The physical pain had dulled, but the weight of the incident lingered heavily in his mind. But something has to change, he added, his voice low yet resonant. This should never have happened, not to me, not to anyone. Reynolds nodded, his face tightening with a rare, sincere frustration. His eyes drifted to Dylan, standing nearby, a shadow of the man who had arrived with such confidence earlier. I saw the footage on my way over, Reynolds admitted, a mixture of anger and disappointment evident in his tone. What happened here is a failure, one we can't ignore. Officer Barnes's actions, they don't represent who we are, or what we stand for. And if they do, then we have a problem we need to face head-on. The chief's words settled over the crowd, who had mostly fallen silent, listening intently. There was an unmistakable edge of resolve in his voice, a hint that this was more than just an attempt to appease the public or smooth things over for now. Reynolds wasn't promising damage control. He was promising something bigger. He turned back to Ethan, his tone shifting from apology to determination. I want you to know, General, that we're committed to making real changes. This incident has exposed flaws, ones we should have seen long ago. Starting immediately, we're reevaluating our training, particularly around bias, community engagement, and the ways we prepare officers to interact with everyone they serve. Ethan's eyes remained on Reynolds, studying the sincerity that seemed etched into every line of the chief's face. He'd heard promises like this before, hollow apologies that faded with time. But something about Reynolds's expression, something in his voice, suggested that this time might be different. This isn't going to be an easy fix, Reynolds continued, glancing at the officers beside him, then back at Ethan. But we owe it to you, to this community, and to ourselves to make it right. We're going to address the biases and the gaps in understanding that have allowed incidents like this to happen. He paused, his voice softening. And that work starts now. Reynolds's commitment resonated with those listening, a spark of hope for the future flickering through the crowd. This was more than a promise. It was an acknowledgement that things had to change, and that real accountability was finally beginning. As the last of the crowd drifted away, leaving only the officers and a few onlookers in the parking lot, Ethan felt a strange sense of familiarity about Dylan that he couldn't shake. It was an odd sensation, as though he'd encountered something from the past in the eyes of the man who'd confronted him today. Grace, who noticed Ethan's far-off look, gently touched his arm. Ethan, what is it? He shook his head slightly, trying to pinpoint the feeling. I think I've seen him before, he replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Memories from his years in service began to surface, fragments of faces, names, places, but nothing fully formed. There's something familiar about him, but I can't place it. Later that night, as they drove home in silence, the image of Dylan's face stayed with Ethan, almost like a puzzle he needed to solve. Grace could see the conflict playing out in her husband's mind and suggested gently, You'll remember, Ethan. Give it time. Unable to let it go, Ethan went to his office the next morning, determined to dig into his memory and the records at his disposal. After hours of searching, something caught his eye, a roster from his early military days, listing familiar names. And there it was, Logan Barnes, a young recruit he'd once supervised. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as the pieces started coming together. Logan had been a promising young man, ambitious, determined, but reckless in ways that concerned his superiors. Ethan remembered clearly now. Logan Barnes had been part of a disastrous mission overseas, one that had gone horribly wrong due to his impulsive actions. During a high-stakes operation, Logan had defied direct orders, endangering the entire unit. In the aftermath, Ethan had been part of the investigation that led to Logan's discharge from the military, a consequence that had left lasting scars on everyone involved. Sifting through more records, Ethan discovered that Logan had struggled deeply after the incident, facing both personal and professional setbacks that eventually drove him out of the military entirely. He'd hoped Logan had found a path forward, but the trail went cold, lost in the years since Ethan's military days. And then, the final connection snapped into place. Logan was Dylan's older brother. Ethan sat back, the realization settling heavily. This wasn't just a random encounter with a police officer harboring a grudge. Dylan's anger, his hostility, it wasn't solely based on bias. It was personal. Dylan had carried this bitterness for years, a grudge rooted not in the present but in a decision Ethan had been forced to make long ago. Grace entered the room quietly, sensing the weight of the revelation on her husband's shoulders. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, his expression a mixture of sadness and clarity. "Dylan's brother Logan. I remember him. He was in my unit. Things didn't end well for him." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He was discharged after a mission went wrong, and I had to be part of the investigation that led to it." Grace absorbed the information, her face thoughtful as she pieced together the implications. "So that's why Dylan singled you out. He's been carrying this resentment, holding you responsible." Ethan's gaze grew distant as he reflected on the years that had passed since Logan's discharge. "I had to make a choice back then, a difficult one. It was about the safety of everyone in the unit. But I see now that Dylan, he sees it differently. To him, I'm the one who ruined his brother's life." Grace reached out, taking Ethan's hand gently, her touch grounding him. "You did what you had to, Ethan. You did what was right." Ethan nodded, though the weight of the situation hadn't lightened. He knew now that this was about more than a single incident. It was the culmination of years of anger and hurt. And it left him with a difficult choice of his own, whether to confront Dylan, not as an adversary, but as someone who understood the painful history they both shared. A few days later, Ethan arranged a private meeting with Dylan, through Chief Reynolds, hoping to finally understand the depth of Dylan's resentment and to confront it head-on. The chief had secured an empty room at the precinct, a space free from interruptions, where either man would hold an advantage over the other. Ethan arrived early, standing by the window as he waited, his thoughts filled with memories of the past and the recent revelation of Logan's connection to Dylan. The door opened, and Dylan stepped inside, his face hollow, the cocky confidence from that night in the parking lot completely stripped away. There was no badge on his uniform, no authority to cling to, just the weight of his own mistakes. He looked at Ethan, his expression a mix of anger, shame, and something close to exhaustion. Ethan motioned to a seat across from him, and Dylan hesitated before sitting, keeping his gaze low, as if avoiding Ethan's eyes would somehow shield him from the truth he knew he couldn't escape. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke. "Dylan," he began, his tone calm but firm. "I know about Logan. I know he's your brother." At this, Dylan flinched, his jaw tightening as he looked up, his eyes dark and defensive. "Then you know why I hate you." He spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "You took everything from him, from us. He was my brother, my family, and you threw him away like he was nothing." Ethan took a steady breath, absorbing Dylan's anger. He understood it. Resentment like that didn't form overnight. "I didn't take anything from him," Ethan replied quietly. "Logan made choices. Dangerous ones. I was part of the investigation because he endangered others, not because I wanted to punish him." Dylan's fists clenched on the table, his face twisted in frustration. "Easy for you to say," he shot back. "You weren't there afterward. You didn't see what happened to him. Logan, he was lost after that. He couldn't hold down a job, he turned to drinking, and eventually, he blamed everyone but himself. But I know it started with you. I know you pushed him out and left him with nothing." Ethan could see the pain behind Dylan's words, the years of watching his brother spiral downward, feeling helpless to save him. He waited a moment, then leaned forward, his gaze never wavering. "I didn't want that for him, Dylan. Believe me. Logan was a talented soldier, but he refused to follow orders. He put others at risk. I had a responsibility to everyone in that unit, including him." Dylan's face crumpled slightly, as if he was fighting to hold back emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I thought, if I could make you pay, if I could take something from you, it'd make things right somehow. Like it'd even the score. Ethan's voice softened, carrying a weight of understanding. And did it? Did any of this make you feel better? Punching me, pulling rank on someone you didn't even know? Dylan looked down, his hands trembling slightly. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It didn't fix anything. I thought it would, but I just felt empty. His shoulders slumped, the anger in his expression slowly fading into something closer to defeat. Ethan studied the broken man sitting before him, a man who had let years of anger and regret shape his life. This was no longer about punishment, he realized, but about helping someone find a way forward. Dylan, he said, his tone gentle but unwavering, we can't change what happened to Logan. I can't undo the decisions he made, and I can't take back the choice I had to make to keep the unit safe. Dylan's breath hitched as he listened, a flicker of acknowledgement crossing his face. I thought if I could bring you down, it would somehow make me feel like I did something for him, like I defended his honor. His voice cracked, a mix of sorrow and shame spilling out. But all I did was make things worse. For you, for me, for everyone. Ethan reached across the table, his hand outstretched as a gesture of understanding. The choices we make, Dylan, don't just affect us. They ripple out. I had to live with the choice I made about Logan, just like you'll have to live with yours. He paused, his expression softening. But it's never too late to change. You don't have to let this anger control you anymore. You have the power to turn this around. Dylan looked at Ethan's outstretched hand, the symbol of a peace he'd long thought was impossible. His face wavered between resistance and a desperate need for release from the bitterness he'd carried. Slowly, he reached out, accepting Ethan's hand, a gesture that felt as heavy as the years of resentment between them. It was an unspoken agreement, a choice to leave the hatred behind and let the scars of the past heal. I don't know how to come back from this, Dylan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've done too much damage to you, to myself. Ethan held his gaze, his words steady. It starts with owning what you've done and making amends where you can. Redemption isn't easy, Dylan. But it's possible if you're willing to do the work. Dylan nodded slowly, the weight of his past choices pressing on him, but for the first time, he felt something different, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way forward. After a long, heavy silence, Dylan finally drew a deep breath, letting Ethan's words sink in. His face, once hardened with resentment, now looked weary but determined, as if he'd made a decision that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. I'll turn myself in, he said quietly, his voice tinged with a mix of shame and resolve. I'll confess everything, from the incident in the parking lot to the other times I let my anger get the best of me. He looked down, his voice trembling. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to face what I've done. Ethan watched him, a glint of respect crossing his expression. Dylan's choice to take responsibility, publicly, fully, was a step many would never have the courage to make. This was Dylan's path forward, the only way he could begin to release himself from the chains of resentment he'd carried for so long. Dylan rose to leave, his stance no longer hostile but resolute. For the first time, he was facing the consequences on his own terms, willing to own the damage he'd caused and the work it would take to rebuild. Weeks passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan returned to his duties, though the events of that evening still lingered in his mind. Then one day, an envelope arrived at his office, its contents bearing the official seal of the precinct. Inside was a handwritten letter from Chief Reynolds. Major General Hayes, it began. I wanted to personally thank you for your strength and integrity during what was one of our most challenging moments. Your actions that night didn't just de-escalate a dangerous situation. They revealed a flaw in our system, one we can no longer ignore. Ethan read on, his gaze steady, taking in each word. Reynolds admitted that the incident with Dylan was a turning point, prompting a full-scale review of the precinct's protocols, particularly regarding bias training, community engagement, and oversight. We are implementing new measures to ensure that what happened to you will not happen again. The letter continued. This is only the beginning. but I am committed to fostering a culture that values respect, accountability, and justice for all. At the bottom of the letter, Reynolds had added a personal note. Your courage reminded me why we do this job in the first place. Thank you for helping us see the path forward. Ethan folded the letter slowly, a sense of quiet resolution settling over him. This wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step toward change, a sign that perhaps, one day, things could be different. As he looked out the window, Ethan knew that the journey toward justice was far from over, but he had set something in motion. Sometimes, real battles aren't fought on the battlefield. They're fought in the hearts and minds of those willing to stand up for what's right. For more stories about courage, justice, and the power of change, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.